for Middle East Security at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. We'll cover it all for you here on the show. Do stay with us. And we are broadcasting live to YouTube as well, if you want to see our pretty faces, says she. All that on the way. Stay with us. First, a full news update with Rob Malarkey.
Kate, thank you. Good evening. President Trump will make a decision on whether to directly involve the United States in the Iran-Israel conflict within the next 2 weeks. Speaking in the last hour, the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said Trump had set the time frame because he believes there is a substantial chance of negotiations with Iran in the near future.
No enrichment of a uranium, and Iran is absolutely not able to achieve a nuclear weapon. The president has been very clear about that. And by the way, the deal that Special Envoy Witkoff proposed to the Iranians was both realistic and acceptable within its terms. That's why the president has sent that deal to them.
The Wall Street Journal had reported that President Trump told senior aides late on Tuesday that he was approving a plan to attack Iran. The Prime Minister has today once again called for de-escalation in the conflict. The Attorney General, Lord Hermer, had warned Sir Keir Starmer that Britain becoming involved in US attacks on Iran could be illegal unless UK personnel were targeted. Speaking to Talk, the Prime Minister said there is a huge risk of escalation across the region.
I'm talking to regional leaders on a daily basis. They're very concerned. It could spill very easily into Gaza, which is already an intolerable situation. And obviously it's having an impact on the economy. So I'm clear in all of my discussions, we need to de-escalate this. Yes, deal with that nuclear programme, but de-escalate and deal with it.
The UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy was scheduled to meet the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio this evening to discuss the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel. Jim Pickard is the Deputy Political Editor at the Financial Times.
I can tell you the principle, the driving intent, is one of de-escalation. And I think you can't draw a straight line between what Stan was saying today and the fact that Donald Trump has given Iran 2 weeks. I don't think Trump is necessarily listening to only Keir Starmer, but it's quite interesting that Trump is keeping everyone guessing.
Israel's health ministry says more than 270 people have been injured today across the country after Iran fired a barrage of missiles. Iranian officials, however, have yet to provide an update on its casualties so far today. Rescue workers and medics in Gaza say at least 12 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces while waiting for aid. Reports say the group was killed by gunfire near an aid distribution site run by the US and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The foundation denied there were any incidents near its site. A PhD student who drugged and raped 10 women in London and China has been jailed for life. Zhenhao Zhou kept what has been described as a trophy box of women's belongings, and he filmed 9 of the rapes that he committed. Detectives say he could have targeted dozens of women, with 20 already coming forward since his conviction. And police have arrested a woman in connection with the death of an award-winning film director who was killed in her home. Jennifer Abbott, who was 69, was found stabbed to death on Friday at her North London home, wrapped in a blanket with tape placed over her mouth. A 66-year-old woman has been arrested on suspicion of murder. Remember, our news podcasts are on the Times Radio app. Look for the Times News Briefing and The World in 10.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker. The Evening Edition with Kait Borsay on Times Radio.
Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion. This operation will continue for as many days as it takes.
This was not self-defense. This aggression constitutes a declaration of war.
I do think that we need to de-escalate the situation. There's a huge risk now of escalation across the region.
Will you strike the Iranian nuclear component? Now, I may do it, I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble.
Well, welcome back to the evening edition. It's me, Kait Borsay, with you on Times Radio, and a very special programme looking at the conflict between Israel and Iran, how we got there and where things go next. We've got an expert panel in the studio with me. I'm calling it a meeting of minds. We're joined by Michael Binyon, who is the Times' former diplomatic editor. We've also got Burcu Ozcelik, who is a senior fellow for Middle East security at RUSI. Hello to you, the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you for being with us. And we've also got Air Commodore Andrew Curtis, a military analyst and former RAF officer, also Chief of Staff of the UK National Support Command in Afghanistan. Andrew, a warm welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Let's look at where we are now. So we're going to, over the next hour, frame what happens now from the US perspective, from Israel and Iran, but of course any UK involvement as well. We'll talk about how we got here. We'll talk about the capabilities of Israel and Iran, and with the US added in, and we'll get a wider context. We'll get a really deep understanding of this conflict. The latest news from the White House, let's start with that. In the last, couple of hours, Donald Trump has said he'll make a decision over Iran and whether the US gets involved in this conflict in the next fortnight. It comes after reports that the president told senior aides he was approving a plan to attack the country. Here's the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt.
Regarding the ongoing situation in Iran, I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks." That's a quote directly from the president for all of you today.
Does the possibility of negotiation sound positive, Michael Binyon? Is that what we're talking about here?
Yes, in a way, but whether they'll actually lead to anything, I'm not sure. Certainly, Benjamin Netanyahu will be very annoyed by this because he wanted an immediate American involvement. He wanted them to come in, make a decisive call, say that they will give Israel the bunker buster bombs that they need, or at least do it themselves, and that would be a swift end, they hope, to the whole thing. Now it looks as though Donald Trump is wanting to spin it out for another 2 weeks. I'm not sure this is going to get anywhere, because for the Iranians, and certainly for the Ayatollah Khamenei, actually giving up the nuclear deterrent, or rather giving up the nuclear research, they haven't even gotten a deterrent yet, would be like what Khomeini called drinking a cup of poison when he had to agree finally to a ceasefire at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. And he was very reluctant to do that. And I think Ayatollah Khamenei is equally reluctant to do anything that would halt what he sees as a vital research program towards building a bomb.
OK, all right. Would it suggest that Donald Trump is perhaps more wary about showing his might, Andrew, showing his strength than we think he might be? He wanted to be the peacemaker, but at the same time, he also likes being the strong man, doesn't he, with the world's biggest arsenal at his fingertips.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think one of the issues at play here is actually Donald Trump's viewing of his own domestic audience. I think we automatically assume that he is considering the world picture. Actually, I think an awful lot of his focus is internal. And within the MAGA movement, there are an awful lot of people who do not want the US to get back involved in another forever war. Trump himself was very clear prior to the election that was not the area that he wanted to be involved in. So I think this is probably a focus for internal US consumption, and ultimately he doesn't have to make a decision now, and I think partly for that reason he has chosen not to.
Burcu, how will this news, this 2 weeks before I make my mind up effective, is what Donald Trump said today, how will that news be received in Iran and in Israel?
Well, I think you're absolutely right in that there are different audiences. One certainly is the U.S. domestic constituency, splits within the Trump administration itself, the more hawkish elements of the MAGA movement and those who don't believe the intelligence necessarily, that they are so close to weaponization as to warrant a preeminent strike. I think another important audience is the Gulf states, the GCC, in that they have been mounting as far as open source suggests, some pressure on the Trump administration not to lose the momentum, the goodwill following Trump's May visit to the Gulf region, economic visions, investment opportunities. So this was a moment where there was a great sense of optimism about the future from the perspective of Gulf member states. And now they find themselves in a very challenging pressure point in that they have been pursuing a policy of détente or normalization with Iran. It's been a very fraught relationship historically. China brokered a normalization deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023, which has held. But again, there's a lot of anxiety and concern within Gulf member states and across the region about conflict spillover. And now in this moment, the 2-week timetable offers a lull, a pause. I suspect in Israel, from the security establishment point of view, on the Israeli side, targeting of strategic regime-linked assets will continue, regardless of the U.S. administration's decision for this 2-week pause. And I think we can't be very confident that the 2 weeks will be a full 2 weeks. I think it's a very, very slippery period.
I'm of that opinion too. I think we've been thrown a little yarn there. Perhaps it gives Donald Trump breathing space, which he may need, but it's within 2 weeks. So Iran will have to be being prepared right now. They can't rest on their laurels, and certainly Israel will continue, as you say, their assault. Who does the 2 weeks? Who does this benefit then, Michael? Is there a better off party if we're looking at Iran and Israel?
No, it doesn't really benefit. Well, it benefits Iran to a certain extent in that they hope it means that the Americans will not get involved and will not bring in the great bunker-busting bomb that is what their great fear, that would probably destroy all the facilities inside Fordow, inside that mountain where the main research is going on. I think, as we've heard, I think Israel will continue, nevertheless, probably intensify their attacks all across Iran and probably look for other targets. It doesn't help Israel at all. It certainly doesn't help Benjamin Netanyahu, because his whole aim right from the start was to tie America in to what he's doing, not only with Iran, but also to make sure that America is not going to oppose what he's still doing in Gaza, which is another area where they're continuing their assault on Palestinians. They're still shooting and bombing Palestinians, still insisting that they want to wipe out Hamas. That has sort of faded from the picture for the moment. And America...
Although the assaults are still very,
they're still going
intensive.
on, yes. But of course, America, which was getting a little bit upset by what was going on in Gaza. Now they're much more focused on what's happening in Iran. And the whole point of this attack now was to make sure that America is brought in on the side of Israel with the bigger picture.
Yeah, just at the point that America, as we understand it, was starting to get to their wits' end over negotiating a separate nuclear deal with Iran. OK, let's move on to UK involvement. Let's put ourselves a little more in this picture. And if you're listening and you'd like to get involved and you'd like to get a question in for any of our experts, as a reminder, we're joined by Michael Binyon. You've just heard him there, the Times' former diplomatic editor. Also Burcu Ozcelik, who is Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at RUSI, an expert across the Middle East region. And also Air Commodore Andrew Curtis, a military analyst and former RAF officer. If you'd like to get your questions in for any of our panellists, Andrew, Burcu or Michael, please do. 0333 003 2353. You can text us 87222, start your message with the word Times, or you can try and drop us a tweet at Times Radio, and I'll try and read as many as I can out in live time. We are also on YouTube, by the way, if you're intrigued as to who the faces are behind the voices. You can have a nose if you like. Join us on YouTube by heading over to the Times Radio YouTube channel. OK, Michael, Burcu, Andrew, let's talk about UK involvement. If we do get a US-backed attack on Iran, should the UK support it? We know that the UK Foreign Secretary and his US counterpart Marco Rubio have been meeting this evening as well. Here's what the Labour MP and chair of the UK Foreign Select Committee, Emily Thornberry, thinks. She's Shadow Attorney, or was Shadow Attorney General as well. She was speaking to Times Radio earlier.
I think that we shouldn't get involved. I don't think that we are under threat ourselves. And I think the argument that one of our allies is under threat and needs our active support is a weak one. Donald Trump was in the middle of negotiations with Iran over cutting its nuclear material and ensuring that it didn't have the ability to be able to build a bomb. And the Israelis attacked. And I think that the best thing to do is to try to de-escalate. And we can't, on the one hand, be saying de-escalate and then actively be involved.
OK, won't get in the way, but won't support it. That is a very strong Labour voice there in Emily Thornberry. Meanwhile, the Conservative Shadow Foreign Secretary, Priti Patel, didn't shy away from supporting the US.
This is simply not a sustainable situation. And we know that talks in recent weeks have failed. And by the way, it was the Americans that brought Iran to the table for talks and discussions. And it was during that period that the IAEA report came out to say that there was an unprecedented level of enrichment of nuclear material taking place in Iran. And of course, that was beyond any use of civilian capabilities.
Andrew Curtis, the UK getting involved, we are talking about anything from authorisation through to potentially air cover, weaponry support maybe. What are we talking about here when we look at UK involvement? What might that look like?
I think from an American perspective, militarily, the UK offers some niche capability that the Americans wouldn't turn away. So, for example, air-to-air refuelling assets, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft. Those assets that are in short supply, ultimately the United States has interests elsewhere in the world, and being able to call upon some of those niche capabilities that the UK is able to provide would certainly be very welcome for the American military.
OK, all right, Michael, in terms of your opinion, what would it mean if the UK did get involved?
Well, we'd be a target straight away for global terrorism. I mean, all British assets all over the world might be subject to revenge attacks by anyone sponsored by Iran. We would be linked with the Americans. The Iranians always believe that Britain is the chief demon among all the Western powers, and they've believed that ever since 1953 with the overthrow of Mossadegh, the Prime Minister that Britain and America managed to oust from power. They've always thought that Britain is the big manipulator. They've rather overestimated our capabilities, but it would mean that Britain would be the focus of attack. I think, actually, it would be extremely unwise to get involved.
Even if it was just giving permission for the Diego Garcia Air Base to be used?
We can't really resist that. I mean, we've got a deal on that. We've got a sort of contract, and we've just more or less renewed it now by saying that there's going to be this long-term
but the US still technically has to ask for our permission.
Well, they do technically.
There is some debate about whether Mauritius need to be asked as well.
I think that's sort of passive involvement. We're not going to stop that. What I think the comparison would be Lyndon Johnson and Vietnam, where for years Lyndon Johnson and the United States were urgently trying to put pressure on Britain to help in the Vietnam War, and Harold Wilson all along said no, and the Americans were rather annoyed about it, but in retrospect that was a good decision. The involvement in US military action in Iraq was not a good decision for Tony Blair or for Britain. I mean, he may have taken it on grounds of principle and whatever, but the final political outcome for him was not very favourable.
OK. Burcu, is Michael correct there? And I'm not marking your homework or anything.
Do, please. Could be wrong.
But is he correct in what he says about Iran basically never having thought favourably of the UK? Do they really have the time and the will to be concerned about punishing the UK should we get involved in this?
Well, historically, it's the fervour around conspiratorial theories about Britain's role in stirring up all sorts of trouble, mischief in Iran, but the wider region, certainly that is there. That's well established and runs quite deep, I would say, inside Iran and beyond its borders as well. Sort of histories of colonialism, the Mandate period. It's not just Iran, but Iran and Britain have a unique, problematic, contentious, but also long-standing relationship. Bear in mind the UK maintains a diplomatic presence inside Iran, which is significant. So those lines of communication have continued and do continue, which poses both an opportunity for Britain, but also puts puts it in sort of jeopardy as well. In terms of the potential that Iran may enter a phase in the future of launching asymmetric or cyber attacks against Western targets, potentially the UK as well, I think that risk exists. It was back in May, not too long ago, that I think 8 individuals were arrested allegedly in connection to potential attack against the Israeli embassy here in London. So this isn't necessarily something that is unprecedented. I think the risk is there, but does it mean that the UK must necessarily get involved at this stage? I don't think there's a strong case for that.
Any of you come in on this, Andrew, perhaps this is for you. Does it make us look bad if we don't get involved? If we say, not for us, we're too busy drinking our tea. We'd rather not sully our bibs, thank you very much.
I think on the world stage, not necessarily. I'm not sure that there are too many other middle-ranking powers who are queuing up to support the United States in this endeavour. So I think if you look at it from an EU perspective, for example, I'm not sure that in Paris or in Berlin they would be particularly worried if the UK did not get involved. I think the bigger issue is the potential impact on the special relationship between the UK and the US, or indeed the UK's perception of the impact of that special relationship, because I think that certainly was the rider if you go back to 2003 and Tony Blair's decision making. I'm not sure the situation is quite the same today, but certainly that would at least be at the back of the Prime Minister's mind.
And there's a trade deal as well that sort of hasn't been fully signed off. So there are other things at play here, which could set some of the context for this.
Yes, absolutely. And don't forget, there is a NATO summit next week. And the expectation is that the US president will be urging 3.5% for military spending, 3.5% of GDP across the European NATO countries. And everybody wants to be on President Trump's good side. And all of those things, I think, will play into what is quite a difficult calculus for the Prime Minister at the moment.
OK, look, thank you. This continues, by the way. You're listening to the Evening Edition, our special programme looking at the conflict between Israel and Iran. Our guest this evening, and indeed all the way through until 9 o'clock, Michael Binyon, the Times' former diplomatic editor, Air Commodore Curtis, you've just heard there, a military analyst and former RAF officer, and Burcu Ozcelik, who is a senior fellow for Middle East security at RUSI. You'll hear more from Burcu, Michael and Andrew all the way through until 9. Next up, what would an attack on Iran actually look like if the US was to get involved, and maybe the UK as well? And how would countries in the Middle East respond? Stay with us.
Hugo Rifkind, Monday to Thursday morning from 10 on Times Radio.
Prepare for a lively mix of illuminating conversation.
Is it just me that strikes me there's a whiff of nonsense about the deal?
Quality journalism, analysis and opinion that speaks for itself.
Even while it drags on and as horrifying as it is, it should have been a foreign policy triumph.
Plus unique perspectives on the day's news.
There seems to be a theme here, and that is that no one knows what's going on.
Hugo Rifkind, Monday to Thursday morning from 10 on Times Radio.
Listeners, we interrupt the airway.
much for being with us. We are in the middle of a meeting of minds. It is an Israel-Iran special here on the show, all the way through until 9 o'clock. We've got some of the best voices in the business to give you their opinions, views and analysis on that escalating conflict. Of course, it's been just under a week since Israel launched the initial attack on Iran. And of course, they have spiked back. And the big question now really is whether the United States lends their hand, whether they get involved to increase the might of Israel's intent. It would also allow them to attack a nuclear facility, at least one that they can't get to under their own steam in terms of the weaponry that they've got. We are joined here on the evening edition, on this meeting of minds, by Michael Binyon, who is the Times' former diplomatic editor, Air Commodore Andrew Curtis with us, a military analyst and former RAF officer, and Burcu Ozcelik, who is a senior fellow for Middle East security at RUSI. Let's talk about what an attack would look like. So let's say the US said, yes, we will help you get into this site at Fordo. It is an underground nuclear facility. I was speaking yesterday to Matthew Saville, Director of Military Services at RUSI, one of your colleagues, Burcu. He was also a former government advisor on Iran. He thinks a strike on Fordo might not be enough.
We're all assuming the destruction of Fordo ends the Iranian nuclear programme. What we don't know, and what the IAEA don't know, because the Iranians have stopped giving them access, is what have the Iranians done with the enriched uranium that they already have? The Israelis have claimed, though without evidence thus far, that they had detected new work by the Iranians moving towards weaponization. So destroying Fordo removes the most heavily defended centrifuge and enrichment facility that we know of. It's not actually a guarantee to the end of the nuclear programme.
Really interesting points raised there. It takes not much uranium, enriched uranium, to make a nuclear weapon. That could have been taken out of Fordo already, put in another facility. There's at least one other facility that the regulatory body have not had access to. We're all, to sort of take it down to a very basic level, banging on about Fordo. It's become one of our new favourite words, hasn't it, across all the broadcast networks, I think we'd have to admit. But that might not even be the half of it, Andrew.
No, absolutely not. And I think we're all on the outside looking in, and there is certainly a considerable amount of intelligence, both that the Israelis and the US possess. That may not be enough, but it's certainly more than we are able to speculate about. But I think the Fordo issue, and this goes back to, I think, Donald Trump and his approach to foreign policy issues. The statement that an attack on Fordo would send, given that the weapons involved and the aircraft that carry them are only available to his military, therefore that would be an intervention that only he could order, I think is quite appealing to him as an individual and Israel's president.
His aim, and Donald Trump and his press secretary Caroline Leavitt saying this repeatedly, their aim is to make sure that Iran cannot produce a nuclear weapon. By going for Fordo, by taking out that particular facility, he's not guaranteeing that. All it does is open the door potentially to even more investigations if there is a strong belief that there is uranium elsewhere.
Correct. And there is no guarantee that the CBU-57 would even be able to penetrate that facility.
This is the bunker buster.
The bunker busting bomb, the MOP, and even actually do the damage that some analysts are claiming. We're not aware exactly how deep that facility is. We're not aware exactly of the protection it has. We're also not aware exactly of the capability of the weapon system itself, because that is classified. And so when you take all of those into account, there is no guarantee that even if the B-2 bombers flew missions against Fordo, that they would actually achieve the aim
do the job
that we are speculating on.
If they did do the job, Burcu, what might happen next? Would Iran respond? Would they say, fair enough, you've got us, we'll de-escalate and we'll come back around the table now?
Well, it's very hard to say. It's speculative because we don't know in advance the extent of the damage that would be inflicted upon Fordow, other nuclear enrichment sites, missile production facilities. I mean, the Israeli campaign has targeted multiple key assets of the regime. The focus on the nuclear program has been a long-term priority for Israel, which sees this as an existential threat. What would come next? Iran has issued for some time now, so this is well documented, that they would retaliate against U.S. bases across the Middle East, of which there are several, as well as troops stationed. We've spoken previously and notably about the Iraq becoming potentially a key conflict theater here. Iran-linked Shia paramilitary groups in Iraq have been issuing statements in support of the Iranian regime. I believe today one of the major groups issued a statement saying that if one hair on Khamenei's head was damaged, that they would wreak havoc upon the American presence in Iraq. So in terms of short-range ballistic missile capability, these groups, predominantly in Iraq, for example, have the ability to hurt American interests.
And that's interesting politically for Donald Trump, because already a huge section of his party have no appetite for war at all. There is an incredible concern about the welfare of servicemen and women. They don't want to repeat. They don't want any more lives lost. And so they'll be incredibly nervous about US personnel in regions like Iraq, close to Iran, that could come under fire in their bases. Got just a couple of questions. In fact, I'll get through one first of all. Here we go. I'll move on from that one because we'll ask it a little bit later. Considering the US walked away from the war in Ukraine and now backs hostilities in the Middle East, Putin must be eager for the UK to divert its support away from the invasion of Ukraine. Michael Binyon, let's aim that one at you. US focus away from Ukraine, now backing hostilities in the Middle East to an extent. Does this help Vladimir Putin in his assault?
Well, he's in a difficult position because Iran is not exactly an ally, but has been very useful to Putin, both as a provocateur, causing the United States a lot of trouble and a lot of difficulties, and also because it does supply a large number of drones and other things that the Russians have been using in Ukraine. And because there's no formal kind of treaty as there was with Syria, they're not involved to that extent. But nevertheless, it would be very awkward to see a country with which they have friendly relations humbled and defeated by the United States.
Which is why, amazingly, Russia's also called for de-escalation in this conflict, something which people might say is a little bit rich when you consider what's going on in Ukraine.
Actually, Russia has been a long-standing supporter of a halt to Iran's nuclear research. They were one of the group that were part of the JC, whatever the treaty is, the nuclear treaty.
The JC...
POA, is it? Yes. Joint, you know what it is. Anyway, that treaty, the Russians were on board with that because they don't want to see a nuclear-armed Iran right on their borders. And I think the relations with Tehran are very much just transactional at the moment. But it does put Putin slightly on the spot. He is very much preoccupied, really, with Ukraine. He doesn't want to get involved in any way in what's going on in this other theatre just on his southern flank.
Michael Binyon, thank you. Stay with us. We'll talk about what Iran's nuclear capabilities are like, how much knowledge do we have of them, and we'll dig a little bit into the history of it also. This is the evening edition. We're with Michael Binyon, the Times' former diplomatic editor, Dr Burcu Ozcelik, who is Middle East Security, a senior fellow for Middle East Security at RUSI, and Air Commodore Andrew Curtis, a military analyst and former RAF officer. They are our guests. This is a meeting of minds over Iran and Israel and what might be next. Stay with us. Let's get a full news update before we reconvene. Rob Malark is with us.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Good evening. The White House says President Trump will make a decision on the level of American involvement in the Iran-Israel conflict within the next 2 weeks. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said Trump believes there is a substantial chance of imminent negotiations with Tehran, and she urged all Americans to trust in President Trump.
President Trump has incredible instincts, and President Trump kept America and the world safe in his first term as president in implementing a peace through strength foreign policy agenda. Nobody should be surprised by the president's position that Iran absolutely cannot obtain a nuclear weapon. He's been unequivocally clear about this for decades, not just as president, but also as a private citizen.
The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, had earlier urged Trump to step back from military action, saying there was a real risk of escalation. A Chinese PhD student who drugged and raped 10 women has been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 24 years. Zhen Haozhou drugged and raped 3 women in London and another 7 in China between September 2019 and May 2023. The Metropolitan Police say he could have targeted dozens more women and have appealed for potential victims to come forward. 3 senior members of Dundee University, including its principal Shane O'Neill, have resigned following a critical review of its finances. An investigation found that poor judgment and inadequate management contributed to a deficit of £35 million. And Manchester City have been fined more than £1 million by the Premier League for poor timekeeping. 9 of City's matches last season either started or restarted late, with the longest delay coming before the second half of the Manchester derby, which resumed almost 2.5 minutes later than billed. For a roundup of the news on demand, find the Times News Briefing on the Times Radio app.
This is Times Radio.
I'm making a robot head with an Amazon box. I've painted it silver, and Daddy helped me make it.
At Amazon, we're actually using paper bags for more of our deliveries.
And now I'm making a paper hot air balloon, and I even made a little brown basket, and I'm making a dog that looks just like
Monday to Thursday afternoon from 2. The Evening Edition with Kait Borsay on Times Radio.
Thanks so much for being with us now. The Times at 1 has a new signing. Next week, Stephen Secker will be here to present the show. He's the former presenter of the Hard Talk programme. He's one of the toughest interviewers in the business. He'll bring all his broadcasting experience and sharp analysis to Times Radio. So don't miss the Times at 1 with Stephen Secker from Monday next week. Can't wait. It's been great to hear from Joe Coburn as well this week. OK, let's return then to the Evening Edition and the second half of our special programme. It's a meeting of minds looking at the conflict between Israel and Iran and the wider global implications of that conflict. We've got an expert panel here in the studio. A warm welcome back to Michael Binyon, the Times' former diplomatic editor. We're also joined by Dr Burcu Ozcelik, who is Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at the Royal United Services Institute, and Air Commodore Andrew Curtis, a military analyst and former RAF officer, also Chief of Staff of the UK National Support Command. He was of the UK National Support Command in Afghanistan. Let's talk about how we got to this point. Let's just add some historical context. We've started to talk about the UK's relationship with Iran, but of course, let's talk about Israel and Iran and the basis of that relationship. Well, there's been a hard edge to it for quite some time. I think we can all agree on that. The Israeli Prime Minister specifically has been mentioning Iran's nuclear capabilities since the 1990s. Is that how long, Burcu, Israel might have been planning a strike? Has this always been on their agenda?
Well, Israel has felt threatened by the Islamic regime since almost the start, since 1979, following the overthrow of the Shah and the revolution, which actually became an Islamic revolution some months later after the overthrow of the Shah himself. And the ideology, the pillars of the regime that came to be under the supreme leader had a number of the security doctrine itself. It evolved in such a way that it prioritized the emergence of a nuclear program, a ballistic missile program, as well as a forward defense sort of agenda, which was the creation and the propping up of a series of Iran-aligned proxy groups across many parts of the Middle East and Arab lands, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen more recently. But the enmity between Iran and Israel was not inevitable, but part of the ideology of the Islamist regime has targeted Israel, has questioned, of course, the right of Israel to exist as a sovereign state in the Middle East, and they have been at war since the beginning of the Islamist regime. It was following the end of the 1980-1988 Iraq-Iran war that Iran began to accelerate its ambitions, both to become a regional power, and that paralleled the rise of the potential of the nuclear program. Iran, of course, we should note, rejects the assumption that they are looking to weaponize, and that they have adamantly insisted that this is a civilian nuclear program only. But of course, evidence has suggested that they have enriched uranium to levels far higher than what would be required for civilian purposes and far exceed other countries that have civilian nuclear capabilities.
Yeah, we mentioned the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, agreed in 2015 by Iran, the UK, China, France, Russia and the US and Germany all involved in that. And as part of that agreement, Iran agreed to restrict the enrichment of uranium to 3.67%, well below weapons grade. We've heard percentages mentioned when we talk about what Iran might be doing, and we don't know for sure. There has been some oversight by the nuclear sort of watchdog body, but they've not been able to get everywhere. The suggestion is that now has gone up to around 60%, Michael Binyon. The US withdrew, of course, as you mentioned, from the JCPOA in 2018, and that really allowed, or Iran feels, change of temperature, change of direction, and that really then started to ramp up Iran's ambitions with nuclear energy, nuclear power, but also weaponization.
Yes, exactly. The Israelis have maintained and maintain now that Iran has already almost reached weaponization enrichment. They have pretty good intelligence all over Iran, and what is so striking is that this intelligence seems to have been so effective in pinpointing both where the Israeli strikes have come, have landed, and what their philosophy and targeting has been for the past week or so. But I'm not sure that this intelligence is as specific as that on the weaponization or possible weaponization. The International Atomic Energy Authority equally has had inspection rights for some time, but these have been on, off, they've been curtailed, they've not been allowed to see exactly what they want to see. And to be frank, I don't think they're very effective as international inspectors. I mean, they are the international body, they're the UN body that looks at this. So nobody really knows exactly where we stand, and of course the Iranians are not going to let it be known. They have sharpened up their attempts tremendously recently, because, as you say, when Trump pulled out of that JCPOA agreement, they felt, well, all bets are off now, we better just go for it. And they've also felt that without the protection of the possible bomb, they really are, especially now, pretty friendless. They've had long-standing quarrels with their neighbours in the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia. They've lost all their main assets in the Arab world. They've been defeated in Lebanon. Their asset, Hezbollah, has been virtually disarmed. They've been chased out of Syria with the fall of Bashar al-Assad. The Houthis are far away and not really very effective, and not much use to them except symbolically. And that's about it. So they have little to rely on now except their own nuclear potential. And I think they're going to go for bust.
We'll come to you in just a moment, Andrew. Interestingly, the sort of question of where is Iran in its nuclear programme potentially nuclear weapons program. This is the big subject of debate. The Iranian ambassador to the UK was speaking to Parliament this week. This is what he had to say.
This attack crossed all red lines. Most alarming, Israel deliberated, targeted a peaceful nuclear facilities operating under the full IAEA safeguards and monitoring. This is a dangerous and illegal act. There is no doubt about it. It posed a serious risk of releasing of the radioactive material. If Iran had not immediately contained the situation, the consequences could have been catastrophic.
Okay, so that is the Iranian ambassador to the UK putting his tuppence into that one. Andrew, in terms of sort of military circles, what is the understanding about what Iran might be capable of, is capable of? Do they have an intent to use nuclear weapons?
I'm not sure that the military intelligence would focus necessarily on the intent. I think that's more of a political decision. I think, to go back to Michael's point about the intelligence, I think that's really quite relevant here, because if we think back to 1981, when the Israelis attacked the Iraqi nuclear facility at Ozcelik, they did so because, in their view, the intelligence was that the Iraqis were getting into a position that they had to stop. Interestingly, at that point, nobody questioned the Israeli intelligence. It was effectively seen as a given. Politics has changed now, and you now see world leaders who are potentially manipulating intelligence or a lack of intelligence for their own ends, which I think is happening a lot more now than it did then. So you have the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who, to all intents and purposes, the day he stops being Prime Minister of Israel, is likely to go to jail. And so you can actually see the situation where it's in his interests to maintain a, let's call it, robust foreign policy, focusing on Gaza and now Iran. And so in that instance, I certainly support Michael's view and would question whether or not the intelligence that Iran were as close as the Israelis have suggested, whether indeed that's accurate.
Yeah, and Caroline Levitt didn't actually answer that question today, interestingly enough, on whose intelligence are you operating. She would not talk about it being US intelligence. Here's a question for you. Please ask your panel what the Prime Minister, what Keir Starmer could possibly mean by the conflict spilling into Gaza. I don't understand how. The Israelis have already destroyed most of it and the population is starving. How could Gaza be further affected? That is from Chloe. Thank you for sending that in. We've had Gaza mentioned a few times in this discussion so far. Who wants to take the answer to this one?
I think if I could just say, Gaza has unfortunately become a secondary theater right now as the world turns its attention to the ongoing war between Israel and Iran. And that is a significant concern, because when the media and civil society and activists shift their gaze further, the crisis in Gaza has escalated, and there has been further deterioration of living conditions in the Gaza Strip, and that's concerning. So the shifting of the gaze, I think, from a policy perspective, away from Gaza is problematic. There was a conference due to take place on the question of recognizing a Palestinian state in France. On the French side, that has been delayed. So it's a matter of shifting the attention.
Why did Keir Starmer mention it then? Was it to bring the attention back on Gaza? Is it to give the public an understanding of how Gaza does relate to this Iranian conflict with Israel, simply because Hamas, who operated in Gaza, conducted the October the 7th attack, are a proxy of Iran?
Well, I hope that was the reason, because I think it is extremely important the world doesn't forget what's going on in Gaza and do what Netanyahu clearly wanted right from the start, which is to shift the world's gaze. That was part of the reason for the timing of what he did in attacking Iran. It was at a time when the Americans were beginning to question everything he was doing in Gaza, and the way the Americans were listening more to the Saudis and other friends in the Gulf with President Trump just having been there. And Netanyahu was beginning to feel a bit unloved and a bit vulnerable. And I think this was a deliberate attempt and giving more of a free hand without the world watching of what's going on in Gaza, which I have to say is frankly appalling.
All right. Well, look, coming up, we're going to take a look at what some of the solutions could be to this conflict and whether Israel are actually after a regime change, and would that be a good thing or not? We'll look at some historical examples too. We've got a meeting of minds this evening here on the show. Michael Binyon is with us, the Times former diplomatic editor with Middle East speciality across security. Burcu Ozcelik is with us, and Air Commodore Andrew Curtis also with us. And there's much more from us to come. Do stay with us. This is Times Radio and the Evening Edition.
The World in 10 podcast is your essential daily roundup of all the biggest stories from across the globe.
The world is getting more dangerous, and every day military specialists and the Times' correspondents help us understand it.
The most likely cause of a world war in the next 10 years, this isn't something you want to get mixed up.
President Putin will sow discord in the alliance.
Listen to The World in 10 to stay on top of the world.
Subscribe for free now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your preferred podcast provider. Download the free Times Radio app from the App Store or Google Play today.
Here's the truth about AI. AI is only as powerful as the platform it's built into.
So much for being with us. We are in the middle of a meeting of minds over the Israel-Iran conflict. Michael Binyon, the Times former diplomatic editor, with us. Dr Burcu Ozcelik, Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at the Royal United Services Institute. Also with us this evening, as is Air Commodore Andrew Curtis, a military analyst and former RAF officer. Now, there are questions about Israel's true intentions. We know that they want to wipe out Iran's nuclear facilities under the threat of Iran creating a nuclear weapon. They say they may be very close to that already. But there have been comments by the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence Minister about chasing down the supreme leader, about how he will not be allowed to exist, and various other iterations that indicate that they are after personnel and people as well as nuclear facilities. And indeed, they've already killed several army military commanders and beyond. They've killed some very senior members of the Iranian administration. So what is the true intent here, Michael Binyon? Let's use history to direct us. Do you think Israel's after a regime change? Is that the only way they think that they can get on top of this nuclear threat for once and for all? Or does it go beyond nuclear weapons?
No, undoubtedly. That is the ultimate aim, because they know that for the Iranian Islamist regime, that is the ultimate defeat. The supreme leader, I mean, he himself, he's very old, but he's not afraid to die as a martyr. But what he wants above all else is for the Islamist government to survive. He feels that the 1979 revolution was the greatest achievement of all. That must survive. And, of course, that is the one thing that is slightly fragile, except that an outside targeting of a regime is a very, very dangerous and delicate and probably unsuccessful mission.
Tell us why.
Well, because others have tried it, and as we saw even in the Second World War, if you try bombing a country, people who don't like what their government and don't like what's going on naturally will rally around the government that they have, the leaders they have. We saw that strategic bombing of Germany. It simply strengthened the Nazi leadership in Germany. It's happened again and again. You try to form or foment a revolution, and the opposite happens. People stick together. They don't like being bombed. We've seen it on a number of Twitters and all sorts of messages on social media from Iranians overseas saying, I hate the Islamist government, but I don't want to see my people bombed.
Burcu, let's just come to you on that with a little bit of context about what life in Iran is like, and the fact that we've seen so many TikTok videos to the point where there's basically a virtual internet blackout now coming out of Iran. People either celebrating Israel striking or celebrating Israel striking, but saying ultimately, I still back our government. I'd rather have our government in place than any other alternative.
Well, it's extremely complicated. Iranian public opinion has been and continues to be divided. I think whether we call it regime change or something else, Iran, in the aftermath of this war, whatever that looks like and whenever that might be, is not going to be the same Iran that before the 13th of June, when this operation by the Israelis began. And yes, opinion has divided in Iran, as well as amongst Iranian diaspora outside of Iran. But the sense is that we don't want war. We want peace and democracy, that being key. So the rallies or the presence or the social media posts, I don't think are indicative of a pro-regime sentiment. And we need to recognize and give credit to the Iranians themselves, who have engaged in wave after wave of civilian dissent and protest movements against the Iranian regime, and have a desire for change.
Yeah, many sort of well-known critics of the regime. There was a son of a former supreme leader, I think I heard, ask about this. He was encouraging Iranians to rise up at this, to take the opportunity and rise up. Will they? Is that a really dangerous thing to incite, considering what is happening in Iran?
It's a very dangerous thing to incite from the outside. As an external shock, regime change has a very poor, appalling record in the Middle East. We don't have to look very far back in history. Consider Iraq post-2003. It's very important that whatever happens in Iran, whatever change this looks like, Iranian civil society is empowered. There's a legacy of political competition and a reformist movement. And so it's important to be able to recognize that, but also recognize that Iran will emerge from this, not only militarily far weaker, but also politically as well. A country of a population that will demand an answer to why the security of the population itself, the borders of Iran, were not sufficiently secured. And so there will be questions when top military commanders, when chief of sort of intelligence figures within the Iranian establishment are targeted or eliminated. The question of security, I think, will bear very heavily on the minds of many Iranians, and there will be a moment of reckoning. This will not be easy, and the future of the regime is, whatever follows it, if that day comes, will likely be a difficult transition, led perhaps by commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
We've seen the example of Syria, haven't we, of a country that is really risen from within, I suppose. If you talk about a revolution happening within, with the overthrow of their leader. I want to finish with you, Andrew, if that's okay, or get nearly to that point, and talk about whether the US get involved in this or not. And let's say that they don't. How long will Israel continue doing what it's doing? What is their ultimate aim, regardless of whether the US join this conflict or not?
I think the Israelis have a number of strategic objectives, and I think those are internally focused and externally focused. I think if the next 2 weeks does not see a US involvement, they will continue to push for US involvement after that time. I think actually bringing the US into the conflict.
Are they going to continue at the pace that they're going, Israel?
I would suspect so. Certainly.
Until when, though?
So that's very difficult to judge, because there are so many factors involved. That their ability militarily to keep this level of operations up, in terms of wear and tear on weapon systems, in terms of
and they've got
armaments.
lots of they've got eyes on Lebanon at the moment. They've of course got what's happening in Gaza, eyes on Yemen and the Houthis as well. This would be another intense conflict for them to have to upkeep.
It would. I think the other thing that this shows is how quickly events are moving, and I think the Trump flooding the zone focus has very much been taken on board by the Israeli leadership, and I think that at the moment what they're doing is helping to do that.
All right, I'm going to leave it there for time. Thank you so much, all of you. It's been a meeting of minds. Michael Binyon, the Times' former diplomatic editor, Dr Burcu Ozcelik from RUSI, and also Air Commodore Andrew Curtis as well. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've been watching on YouTube, thank you for your messages on YouTube, by the way, much appreciated. Stay with us. We've got more on this and UK politics to come. Stay with us. It's the evening edition.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
A fascinating discussion. You'll be able to watch it back on YouTube as well if you missed it. Head to the Times Radio YouTube channel. And once again, thank you for getting in touch. So many messages into the show. We got through a few of them. I hope that's okay. And also on YouTube as well. We've really enjoyed digging deep into the Israel-Iran conflict and what happens next, the potential involvement of the USA. Coming up then, the historian Tessa Dunlop joins us alongside the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Steve Baker. We'll discuss a little on this, but then we'll dive into some of the other main stories of the day. And after 9:30, we're joined by a special correspondent at Reuters who's been leading an investigation into Russia resorting to using untrained spies after its diplomats and operatives were expelled from Europe. Many of those untrained spies are teenagers. It's a fascinating story. That's coming after 9:30 here on the show. Do stay with us. Let's get a full news update first from Rob Malarkey.
Case, thank you. Good evening. President Trump will make a decision on whether to directly involve the United States in the Iran-Israel conflict within the next 2 weeks. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt this evening said Trump had set the time frame because he believes there is a substantial chance of negotiations with Iran in the near future.
Regarding the ongoing situation in Iran,